As we mark the 4th International Day of Education, there's no doubt the COVID-19 pandemic has negatively impacted the sector over the past 2 years. Now, Unicef are calling for concerted action on learning. The organization says school must be the last to close and the first to open. They maintain that when schools shut down, children not only lose out on education, but school safety is compromised. To discuss this further, we're now joined by the education advisor at Unicef Eastern and Southern Africa region, Abhiyan Rana. Thank you so much for your time, Abhiyan. We do appreciate it. I think when we speak about education in the context of COVID-19, we cannot not focus on the kind of impact this pandemic has had on education and schooling overall. What are you finding in the last 2 years or so since this pandemic emerged?
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for having me. I think the first and the foremost thing that we need to look at is how long schools have been closed because of the pandemic. It's been closed for some countries for over 2 years, and children have not been able to come back into school. This is leading to a really big issue around education, and we knew that there was an education or learning crisis globally, that children were going into school but were not learning. And now with this 2 years of closure, this learning crisis has been exacerbated into becoming almost like a learning catastrophe. And I think we need to have a concerted effort in trying to see how we first bring all the children back into school, because when there is long closures of school, there's a tendency of not ever coming back to school. We see about 20–30% of children never coming back to school. So we need to focus on first trying to get everybody back into school, and then focus on how do we make sure that they catch up on the learning that they had lost, and then continue that trajectory in their learning for a good life, for any activity or any areas of life or work that they want to get into. The foundational literacy and numeracy needs to be in place.
Certainly, and I think the devastating impacts that COVID-19 has had on almost every sphere of life, but most importantly on the education sector, I think sometimes we underestimate that. But I want to go into the issue around reading and literacy. I know that reading is a very big problem. Our children are not reading the way they should be reading, where the country allows, and those that have access to cell phones are sitting on their gadgets and not actually picking up a book to read. And on this International Day of Education, how much of a problem is it in our education sector? Do we have that children are not actually able to read and are not reading even if they are in an environment where they should be reading?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. We knew there was a learning crisis before the pandemic hit, which meant that globally, about 53% of children that were 10 years old could not read a simple line and understand it, meaning we were calling them learning poor. And now with the pandemic, the 53% globally has gone up to 70%. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it was already at 87%. So we're talking about 87% of children in sub-Saharan Africa, 10 years old, whether in school or not, were not able to read a simple line and understand that. And now that has gone over 90%. So it is really, really a big, big issue that we're facing in education, in trying to see how we need to bring all children back into school and continue on their learning. The other thing that really happened during this pandemic was the attempt from many countries to try and see how we can do this by remote learning. And with that, we're talking about digital learning, online learning, radio, TV, and that has been a challenge. And I think that is something that we have learned in terms of being prepared for any such pandemic or any such crisis, where we are, as a country, able to respond to that and reach all the children and make sure that they are learning. So this pandemic has moved us, and as you can see with the theme of today's day, the International Day of Education, it's about changing course and transforming education. And I think one of the biggest ways that we can transform education is to see how we can progressively make digital education part of our education system and make sure that children are ready for the new era of the digital world and are ready to learn and face the world as they move forward.
It's such an important aspect that you touch on with regards to digital learning, because even before COVID-19, there was an issue around access to digital learning. So I think that's definitely been exacerbated with the pandemic. But I just quickly want to ask you with regards to other learning losses that have been experienced, and possibly because of COVID-19. But I do know that there was an education crisis report by the World Bank and Unicef, if I'm not mistaken, where the economic costs of learning losses, the generation stands to lose $17 trillion in lifetime earnings, or about 14% of today's global GDP, due to the COVID-19 pandemic-related school closures and the economic shock. So the school closures also are going to directly impact the economic gains that we could have possibly gained, but because of the impacts of COVID-19 that it's had on the education sector, this is very worrying, isn't it?
It is totally worrying. Children are not getting the basic foundational literacy and numeracy that they need to be able to compete in the world as they move forward into the world of work. And without that foundational literacy, numeracy, and the other life skills, including digital skills, they will not be able to compete and perform at the level that they should be. And hence, if the report that you mentioned and the $17 trillion of loss that you mentioned is going to be a reality if we don't tighten our belts and focus our energy around how do we respond to the education crisis that's happening globally and in our region as well, to make sure that we bring every child back into school, into a safe learning environment in the current context, and to ensure that every aspect of pedagogy that is required to make sure that the child is learning is put in place. And this is a big, big responsibilities for the governments, but I think it is something that they really need to tackle seriously if we want to address where we are going with our children in the next coming decade. I mean, we talk about the demographic dividend in Africa, and if you are to realize that, I think if we don't focus on education and specifically on learning and digital learning, I think we are going to be heading towards a big, big disaster in the future.
Well, hopefully it's not too much of a disaster and action is taken as quickly and as swiftly as possible. Thank you so much for your time. That's Abhiyan Rana, the Education Advisor at UNICEF Eastern and Southern Africa, coming to us live from Kenya.